Good morning. I am Jim Woolsey, the president of DAU, and it's my pleasure to work with a great panel here to talk about an important subject of our day, which is the Adaptive Acquisition Framework, and especially the MTA provisions that we talked about already this morning. We'll talk about some more today. I'm going to start with a news flash. The DoD is a big bureaucracy. You heard it here first. And it goes slowly and doesn't respond the way we would like it to. You heard that here first as well. And the reason I bring that up is that I think it's important that we do more than talk about platitudes and generalizations, but we get into specifics about how we can make things work better. And as part of that, it occurs to me that it's kind of obvious how we got to where we are. And that isn't to make excuses, it is to understand. So that'll help us move forward. And if you look at the history of acquisition and actually bureaucracies in general, because this isn't just a government problem, the private sector struggles with it as well. If you want to blame somebody, you can blame Frederick Taylor. That's over 100 years ago, but he was all about scientific management, how we're going to optimize processes to make everything as efficient as it can be, as predictable as it can be. And he was so extreme that he apparently once found the optimal amount of dirt to move with every stroke of the shovel. That's really getting into it. And that made sense when we were building Model Ts, which Henry Ford was a disciple of Mr. Taylor. And we've been working with that similar industrial model for so many decades. And once you have that model, sure enough, there's going to be someone who will measure the dirt and make sure that we're moving the right amount. And there'll be somebody inspecting the dirt to make sure that it's done the right way. And if you look at the way acquisition and bureaucracies grow, you can see these effects that aren't crazy. They're actually rational in the systems that we have. You build in a process to inspect, you build a process to check, and you want to reduce risk. If you're going to build a factory to build Model T Fords, you really need to make sure that nothing goes wrong. We have to make sure there's no problem. So we check more things and we put more people in charge of the checking. And maybe not coincidentally, Robert McNamara gave us the PPBE, which we are talking about today. He's actually a Ford guy too. So you can take it all the way from Henry Ford to Robert McNamara and then through the things that we have done since then. I think that background is important as we think about where we are today. It isn't a unique problem. It isn't just government, and it is what happens with large organizations. And then let's talk about that in a way that is more subtle than just saying acquisitions broken or bureaucrats are risk averse. Let's look at what actually happens and do some experiments and get down to it, which brings us to the Adaptive Acquisition Framework. There's a lot of good things going on in acquisition today to try to get past the nature of bureaucracies and work through them. Dr. LaPlante referred to some of those this morning. And the one we're going to talk about today is the Adaptive Acquisition Framework and the mid-tier authority that's within that. What I really like about the AAF are a couple of things. One is that it delegates decision-making to lower levels. That's a key to shrinking any kind of bureaucratic goo that you find yourself in. I think that's really important. I also like that it makes distinctions. It doesn't treat combat boots the same way as aircraft carriers. It is by its nature trying to say that things are different and we should treat those in different ways. And I also like that it has been widely embraced. We're doing experiments and we're trying to work how to improve on the provisions that we have, which brings me to the panel that we have here today. So we have a variety of experiences, and they are going to talk about research they've done that is about, we're 5 years into MTA, we're 5 years into AF, how are we doing? And what kinds of things should we be looking at to improve as we move forward? And I'd like to give them each a chance to talk very briefly about their background and where they're from, starting with Stephanie Young from RAND.
Thanks, Jim. So I'm Stephanie Young from RAND. I'm the director of the Resource Management Program in RAND Project Air Force. This is the part of RAND that supports the Department of the Air Force and issues related to acquisition, industrial base, logistics, sustainment, infrastructure, and installation resilience. And I will be providing some comments as a discussant today on the panel. Cynthia?
I'm Cynthia Cook. I'm the director of the Defense Industrial Initiatives Group at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and a senior fellow in the International Security Program there. We do a variety of work. My red light's on. We do work on a range of. Okay. And as I was saying, we do work on a range of topics relating to acquisition, the industrial base. We have pretty close connections with industry. So I did the research I'll talk about there based on that. And before I came to the CSIS, I spent 25 years at the RAND Corporation in a variety of research and management roles. And over to Megan.
Hi, I'm Megan McKernan. I am a senior defense researcher at RAND, and I've done a lot of different things related to data and analytics, working closely with OSD over the last probably 6 or 7 years. I've probably interviewed people in this room for various studies, I'm sure, and we thank you for that. Over to you.
Good morning. My name is Alexis Olson. I'm a senior analyst with the Government Accountability Office, and I work on the Contracting and National Security Acquisitions team. I led GAO's recent work on middle tier of acquisitions and have done some other work related to Navy's uncrewed vessels, as well as led many reviews on DHS's major acquisition programs over the years. Been with GAO about 10 years.
Good morning. I'm Chris Durbin. I'm with GAO as well, our Contracting and National Security Acquisitions team. I'm an assistant director. I've been with GAO for 20 years, evaluating defense acquisitions for most of that time, as well as doing leading practices review, looking at how leading companies in industry get better product development outcomes consistently as compared to government agencies.
Thank you. So as the other panels have done, what we'll do here is give each of the panel members a chance to describe the research that they've done, and then we will take questions and answers both from the audience and from remotely. So Megan, let's start with you. Dr. LaPlante set you up nicely. He talked about data and how important it is. And that is an area of your research. So please go ahead.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to talk about the adaptive acquisition framework and metrics. But first, I want to thank Mr. David Cadman, who is the acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Acquisition Enablers. He provided a lot of thorough input to our study, and he was the sponsor, along with Brian Joseph, who was our action officer. I'd also like to thank the sponsor of this forum. We were happy to be able to present here on this work. So the adaptive acquisition framework has existed since 2020 in policy. We know that some of the pathways started before then, and it needs to be examined for effectiveness. The GAO requested metrics from the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment to evaluate pathway performance. At the same time, DoD leadership is also interested in metrics and is actively collecting data to inform how the pathways are working. So this analysis is complete, and we do have a lot of insights that will help leadership and also the GAO. So this figure depicting the 6 acquisition pathways is familiar to this audience. This is one of the more significant changes to the defense acquisition system since 2015, and it created a set of distinct acquisition pathways known as the adaptive acquisition framework. Congress initiated these changes by providing statutory relief to DoD through the introduction of the middle tier of acquisition pathway and also the software acquisition pathway, which were both instantiated in law. DoD then completed the adaptive acquisition framework by designing additional pathways to accommodate the diversity of systems and services that DoD acquires, as can be seen in the various pathways. The adaptive acquisition framework is intended to create a more tailored process that reflects that diversity. The underlying assumption is that improved and more specific tailoring of program management and execution will enable DoD to acquire capabilities it needs more effectively and efficiently. So this research builds on some prior RAND research that we did from 2019 to 2021 that identified acquisition metrics to assess the health of the overall acquisition system. During the prior analysis, our team systematically identified strategic questions, metrics, and analytics that would assist DoD in understanding how well it is meeting its shorter term and longer term goals. We used the strategic goals by former Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, Ellen Lord, as a starting point for the analysis. And we carried that through to this analysis, which started before we had the changeover in administrations. In this current research, we used a methodology that includes a rigorous policy review, a broader literature review on metrics, and a series of stakeholder interviews on topics that included pathway-specific goals, current metrics, and data governance management and analytic issues. We talked to folks not only in OSD, but also in the components to understand the kinds of data they're already collecting so that we don't duplicate effort. We also used a simplified logic model, which I'll explain now. Central to this metrics identification and evaluation is generating a logic model that describes the linkages among inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and strategic goals. In this current research, we derived a simplified logic model from the more detailed one in the related RAND study. We then applied this logic model to the individual pathways with an additional step, which is step 6, that compares metrics with current data. We did not identify the metrics in a vacuum. We consulted with OSD policy owners and along with the data community and the services in order to understand the current metrics that were being collected. This was important because we were trying to understand feasibility of the metrics. In other words, is the data currently available or will there need to be a data collection effort? As is good practice in enterprise level metrics, we chose a limited set of metrics to start. 5 were chosen for each pathway from a list of over 75 that we pulled together using the logic models. There's no right or wrong answer for the exact number, but it is counterproductive for an organization to start by implementing a large number of metrics. It's important to note that any metrics should be able to be rolled up into a portfolio level metric to address the health of the pathway. Most importantly, we identified challenges to developing metrics both within and across the pathways. This provided OSD with an understanding of challenges during implementation. Identifying metrics to measure the health or performance of each pathway is associated with various challenges, which you can see on the slide. There's a lot to unpack on this slide, so I'll just give you a couple of examples here. There are some common challenges across the pathways, like determining what programs are actually using each pathway and why they're using the pathways. Identifying the strategic goals was actually a pretty difficult task up front and required a lot of discussion with OSD and the services. Identifying authoritative sources of data was likewise a challenge. One challenge in particular that exists across most of the pathways when conducting analyses of the adaptive acquisition framework. The amount of and the specific data elements collected are intentionally different within and across the pathways, although it is not necessarily problematic. Additionally, the urgent capability acquisition software and middle tier pathways share a common challenge of trying to balance the schedule imperative with information requirements for monitoring and oversight. Within both the middle tier and the major capability pathways, there is less data available for non-major middle tier programs and lower ACAT level programs than for major capabilities. This means that some of the metrics will reflect only larger programs, which poses a challenge when you're trying to roll them up into a portfolio. There's also several unique pathway challenges that we found. And this is a short list. For the urgent capability acquisition pathway, the existing data are difficult to acquire due to disaggregated governance across the joint staff and the components. OSD is responsible for joint urgent capabilities only. The components have additional urgent capability processes, but the existing data are mostly decentralized in components and are almost entirely classified. We identified multiple middle tier challenges. First, a majority of middle tier programs are lower dollar value programs with a minimal set of information that's available. There's also tension between the schedule imperative and information requirements, as I noted earlier. For the major capability pathway, less data are available on the ACAT 2 to 4 programs at the component acquisition levels, and the available data may differ among the components. Additionally, the components are not required to share all of this data for the smaller programs with OSD. So the software pathway is ramping up. So data collection is in its early stages. Additionally, software acquisition metrics are different from typical cost, schedule, and performance metrics. Software supports continuing evolution across the life cycle of the system and does not have discrete acquisition and sustainment phases. Deliveries are continuous and no acquisition program baseline exists. The acquisition of services pathway does not have entry documentation. In other words, a formal declaration that a program or effort is going to use the pathway. So analysis relies solely on labor-intensive data collection to assess what programs are using the pathway. Other acquisition of service pathway unique features include the unit of analysis being a contract or contract action, not necessarily a program. And there's a tremendous variation in size of the programs. So bringing us back to the goal of this analysis, our focus is on identifying metrics to assess the performance of each pathway, whether the pathway is achieving its intended outcome and strategic goals. This slide lists the five initial metrics recommended for 3 of the pathways. These metrics link back to the strategic goals of each pathway, as is best practice in identifying metrics. Among each of the 5 metrics per pathway, some measures are more critical to a pathway's health than others, but all will help DoD leadership in the GAO with better insight into the health of the adaptive acquisition framework. Traditional cost, schedule, and performance metrics are included in the initial set of recommended metrics, but are tailored to the specific pathway. We also include 2 additional unique metrics per pathway that provide more direct measures of pathway health. We have selected metrics for which data are available or data gaps can be readily resolved. So this second slide contains the initial set of metrics for the 3 other pathways. Notice the differences in metrics for acquiring software, which are more cyber-related, software-related, than for defense business systems or acquisition of goods and services. I'll end this presentation with some overall findings that we had from this analysis. First, strategic goals are critical. They define the use cases for each pathway and therefore associated metrics and data needs. The recommended metrics should also be regularly reviewed for relevance and should be expected to change in response to changes in strategic goals. This is particularly relevant based on what Dr. LaPlante said this morning about some of the global changing environment. And so these kinds of metrics would also change. Okay. Also, regular and well-defined data governance and management procedures should be established and maintained for all of the pathways. Acquisition Enablers has been working with the pathway owners and the data owners and the components to establish both data governance and data standards for each. Also, a high level of subject matter expertise is required to gather and process the necessary data, conduct the analysis, and interpret results. This finding cannot be understated. Facts, assumptions, limitations of the source of the data must be clearly and deeply understood to allow for accurate processing. Pathway-specific data challenges are also exacerbated by interconnectedness through multiple pathways. So some programs will start in one pathway, move to another, or there will be a combination of programs that will end up in the major capability pathway. This is definitely a significant analytic challenge because merging the data may lead to maybe misleading. And the output of this initial set of metrics should inform decisions to refine policy and process and improve pathway performance and outcomes. So it's important to acknowledge that the data needed for pathway performance metrics are not the only data needed to understand the operation of the defense acquisition system. As Dr. LaPrant mentioned earlier, he is looking for data and metrics to understand DoD's performance across acquisition and sustainment. And this was within a very complex and dynamic global environments. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions in the question and answer period.
Thank you, Megan. We'll now move to the GAO, and you did some work looking at how well we're doing the things we're supposed to be doing already and some recommendations about improving in those areas. So please tell us about that.
Thank you, Jim. I'm Chris Durbin again. On behalf of my colleague Alexis Olson, really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you today about our recent work looking at one of the 6 adaptive acquisition framework pathways, our work on middle tier acquisitions. This is a report that we issued in February of this year. And in case you're interested, the photo on the cover slide here is a product of the Army's Short Range Reconnaissance MTA program. It's a small uncrewed aircraft. A soldier can transport it around in a rucksack, and it provides ISR capability at the platoon level. And it's really one of the more thoughtful MTA case studies that we reviewed in terms of how it's structured. The Army has structured the program around different tranches of capability that aren't pre-planned or pre-forecasted, but placeholders to account for user input on the initial capability that the program delivers, and also accommodates ongoing technology advancements to be able to bring those two things together in new iterations of capability as the MTA program moves forward. But what we looked at in this review are really 2 things. The first is the MTA policies and programs at the military component level, and the extent to which they implement leading practice or leading principles for product development. Leading principles are new criteria GAO has developed that reflect the key things leading companies do to deliver innovative products to their customers fast. And they do that in environments where speed to market is imperative. We've applied these to MTA programs and policies in the context of this report, but these leading principles are applicable to any development effort or acquisition pathway that results in some type of product. And in 2022, we evaluated 4 of the 6 acquisition pathways within the AAF, identified some gaps between the language in those pathways at the DoD 5000 series level, and recommended DoD make some changes to the pathway policies, which they agreed to do. And we look forward to seeing what comes of that. The second objective we covered relates to DoD's ongoing efforts to ensure that reliable data are available to inform MTA oversight. And this has been an issue that the Office of Secretary of Defense and the military components have wrestled with since the advent of MTAs. The tension lies in components being responsible for oversight of MTA programs, while the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment is responsible for oversight of the MTA pathway. So using DoD's own criteria, our report gives an update on the latest actions DoD has taken to ensure available, reliable data on MTAs. I think it's important to set some background as far as the expectations that DoD has defined for the MTA pathway. First and foremost, deliver capabilities within 5 years. And what I want to emphasize here is that 5 years is a ceiling, it's not a floor. And I think sometimes that gets forgotten. But they seek to deliver innovation with speed through 2 different means. Skipping down to the third bullet, rapid fielding, get proving technology into the hands of warfighters quickly, but also rapid prototyping. Recognize that warfighter needs rapidly evolve and capabilities need to be matched to the latest cutting edge technologies. that the S&T base is putting forward. The last bullet, is important as well. Not all programs are appropriate for the MTA pathway. MTA pathway is not necessarily congruent with long linear development programs that prioritize development and delivery of elegant capabilities. So that's not an appropriate structure for going fast, which the MTA pathway seeks to provide for. And this slide gives a little more detail on our leading principles that our work over the past 3 years has identified as paramount to delivering innovative capabilities quickly. We've had extensive meetings over that time period with upwards of 30 leading companies across a variety of industries, predominantly ones that design and manufacture what are called cyber physical products. So products that rely on both hardware and software to deliver functionality. Companies like Google, HP, Siemens, Volvo Group, SpaceX are just a few of the several that we've met with to learn how they go about product development. And what I'd emphasize is that these principles, while numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, are not sequential in nature, but rather they show up throughout a product development. For instance, principle 1, attain a sound business case informed by research and collaboration with customers. What this does not mean is set a rigid cost and schedule baseline at program start and then 5 years later check back to see how you did. Rather, it refers to an ongoing process where product developers, users, and resource sponsors come together with the goal of ensuring that the capability under development matches the agreed upon most critical needs and expectations of the program. And also fundamental to principle 1 is the importance of failing fast. And we'll talk about that more later. Principle 2 centers on the value that an iterative design approach provides to leading companies. They organize iterative design around what are called minimum marketable products. That's also a synonym for minimum viable products. Everyone knows that Rome wasn't built in a day. I'd offer that it wasn't designed all at once either. I think a focus on delivering the minimum capability needed to provide value and then continually improving on that capability through successive iterations is a way to ensure that you're delivering innovation to users with speed. The third principle focuses on the importance of schedule and prioritizing schedule. This doesn't mean, though, by off-ramping capabilities when needed. This doesn't mean, though, that you pay more just to get less in the end, but rather throughout product development, continually taking stock of what is a critical need versus what is a nice to have with an eye toward how you can continue to improve the structure of the program to deliver capability faster.
Pardon me, Chris, I'm gonna have to ask you to be mindful of the time. Alexis is chomping at the bit and she's gonna want to get in as well.
I can move quickly. So I think the setup here is key.
Principle 4, partner with customers and users to inform what becomes the minimum viable product and the iterative improvements to that MVP. It's not something that just happens at the beginning and end of a program, but rather throughout. I'd also say as a quick sidebar, I think a lot of people hold up other transactions and other transaction agreements as the essential ingredient to making MTAs go fast. I'd offer there's a big difference between starting fast and finishing fast. I think while OTs help start fast, leading principles is what would help MTAs finish fast. And slide 5 gets into some of our analysis looking at component MTA policies. We have evaluated, those different policies specific to MTAs within Army, Air Force, Navy, and SOCOM. Found a mixed bag of results. Importantly, none of the component policies fully implement any of the 4 leading principles our work has identified as important. For the sound business case, none of the policies recognize or identified that importance of failing fast. And what that can sometimes do is lead to acceptance of programs that take 5 years, don't deliver a useful capability in the end, but people take solace in the fact that they know more now at the end of 5 years than they did going into the 5 years. I would offer that that's the place for that type of outcome and learning is science and technology, not in an acquisition pathway where the goal is to deliver capability. And the second principle, using an iterative design approach, we didn't see any mention of minimum viable products in these component policies, which is important. For the third principle, prioritizing schedule, we didn't see mention of off-ramping capabilities in order to deliver things to our capabilities quicker, the most critical capabilities sooner. And then finally, the fourth principle, collecting customer feedback. Our review of the policies didn't show that they identified goals or requirements for taking customer and user feedback on a product and then turning that into a subsequent iteration of the product that improves it further for evolving needs.
So, after conducting that policy analysis, we really decided, we had heard a lot that there was the leading principles were really reflected in the implementation and practice of these programs. They didn't need to be in policy because it was happening in practice. So we decided to take our work to the next level and to conduct the work. We'd already selected 15 of the approximately 100 MTA programs that the department had at the time. And we looked through acquisition strategies and plans to identify where or the extent to which the programs had their plans reflected the leading principles of product development. And what this slide shows is kind of the cross-section of the case studies. So we've got 4 components representative, all that had MTAs that were active at the time, rapid prototyping, fielding, and then with major, non-major, and MDAP equivalent MTAs. So we had a cross-section where we weren't just looking at a specific segment of the MTA population. And generally what we found is that the programs also are not implementing leading principles of product development in their acquisition plans. Oh, goodness. There we go. All right, so with regards to principle 1, as noted here, we found a number of instances where programs were really more structured to start fast versus focusing on finishing fast. And couple of examples here include, the components were approving funding for programs despite disconnects with stakeholders on key issues. So for example, the Future Operationally Resilient Ground Evolution Program had significant discrepancies in cost estimates and schedule estimates. And we were seeing that 2.5 years into the program's MTA cycle. So it was initiated in 2019 when we were finishing up our work in mid 2022. Those discrepancies had yet to be resolved. In addition, although acquisition strategies often identified technology and design risks, we were seeing we weren't seeing triggers that enable programs to fail fast. And an example here is the Army's integrated visual augmentation system. This began as a rapid prototyping effort. They ran into some issues during testing, but wanted to proceed with that rapid fielding program to try to get things to the end user quickly. 2 years after they initiated that rapid fielding effort, they had yet to go back and fix some of those things that were identified as deficient in testing. So what happens then when you're really eager to start and you're not setting up your programs to finish fast successfully, and you're at risk of delivering a deficient product to your end user. Moving on to principle 2, and this is what Chris had alluded to earlier, that iterative design approach really is the exception rather than the rule for the MTA pathway. Only about half of our programs had in their acquisition strategies had outlined most of the elements related to this principle. He mentioned the short range reconnaissance program. Yes, that was executing in that phase capability releases. And what we found is that program, or the structure of that program, allows it to field that new and innovative capability and get that capability into the hands of operators in a way that allows them to keep pace with industry, innovation, and our peer adversaries. In contrast, though, we were finding that like the Navy's conventional prompt strike program, that acquisition strategy that we reviewed at the time, was much more of a linear development process where capability in the current MTA effort is intended to support a full capability system planned under future rapid fielding and major capability acquisition efforts. The acquisition strategy, detailed plans of what will happen in the next phase with very defined requirements without a process to incorporate that user feedback along the way. Moving on to principle 3. This is where we found a number of instances where components decisions to off-ramp capabilities were late and after optimistic assumptions about the pace of development faltered. And we have seen this not just in our work on the MTAs, but also across our portfolio of work on MTAs, which includes our annual assessment of defense major acquisition programs. That includes MTAs. A key example here is the Army's Extended Range Cannon Artillery Program. It was initiated in 2018, has run into technical difficulties multiple times, restructured, has pared down to just to prioritize very fixed requirements, and the program plans to continue beyond its 5-year MTA in development efforts, the 5-year MTA timeline under CAA oversight, because they are not able to complete the efforts that they set out to do originally under the MTA pathway. And this is an example where maybe, the technology was not as mature as it was as expected when they started out on the pathway. And maybe failure doesn't look like just quit this effort, but maybe this is something where, holding these programs back as an research and development or science and technology effort so that it is ready to go onto a pathway that can allow it to get to end users quickly once that technology is mature. Maybe something like that would be a better path forward. Moving on to principle 4, collecting customer feedback. In our review of the acquisition strategies, we found that the Army, Air Force, and SOCOM, those acquisition strategies generally emphasized obtaining user feedback throughout the development process. The Navy's did not, and that these documents did not identify processes for using that feedback, though, to inform capability trades and follow-on efforts. The effort of time, I'll skip some examples because it really, those bullets really do kind of emphasize our findings. But overall, with the implementation in the policies that we saw, and then also, what we saw, the inconsistencies with the leading principles we saw in the program acquisition strategies, we feel that there's value in adding the leading principles of product development into policies. So we ultimately made 4 recommendations, one related to each principle, to each of the 4 components to include the leading principles of product development in their MTA policies. I'll quickly run through our findings on the other objective, which was, just to reiterate, to what extent has DoD effectively implemented policies, guidance, and processes that provide reliable data to inform MTA oversight. Bottom line here, DoD components, as we have shown you, have implemented or established policies for MTAs, but they haven't fully documented and established required processes under DoD's MTA acquisition policy, or DoD's MTA acquisition policy, the 5000.80. And if they haven't implemented those processes that are required, the department is limited in its ability to evaluate the effectiveness of the pathway. So we made recommendations to each of the components to fully implement those processes. And then data, I think we echo what Megan has found regarding data. This is an area where there's tension within the department, right? There's the components who are overseeing these programs, and DoD who has the portfolio look. So it is really a kind of a partnership and shared responsibility to address the data issues. We found areas where DoD hasn't defined the requirements for the data that they need, that they've established that they need in policy. And then we found issues with our 15 case studies where the data was simply just not reliable. It was not entered in line with the policies and guidance that DoD has established. So in summary, well, we did make recommendations to both the components and DoD related to data, improving the data reliability as well. So in summary, I think we think the MTA pathway has the potential to be a really powerful tool to develop and deliver innovative capabilities quickly, but it's not necessarily the only tool. That, as Chris mentioned, the pathways can be used in a number of ways, and the leading principles are applicable across the pathways. And to fully capitalize on the potential of the MTA pathway, it requires thoughtfulness in establishing program structures and the types of programs that you're putting on the various pathways. And then the policies that require MTA programs to incorporate the leading principles of product development are necessary to position DoD to achieve its goals that it's laid out in its policies for the MTA pathway. So in total, we made 26 recommendations to DoD and the components aimed at improving the oversight to help improve the development or the development processes. And DoD confirmed with 25 of them and partially confirmed with 1.
Thank you. And reading your report, I was impressed with the detail and the thoroughness of it. And as you know, we were able to improve some of the data consistency because of that. So thank you for that. Thank you for the talk. Now, they talked about customer feedback, Cynthia. My favorite feedback is to ask myself how I'm doing. And I say, I'm doing great. Thank you. But better to ask others, and we're guilty of that in the Department of Defense. How are we doing on MTAs? We're doing great. What you did instead was go out to the private sector and ask them how they thought we were doing. And what did you learn?
Thanks, and 2 interesting presentations. Thank you. So my paper is a product of a number of interviews I had with industry to find out how they're experiencing innovations in acquisition, and with the goal of ensuring that innovation survives acquisition. I would note that this was funded by general support to CSIS. A list of our donors is available on the website. These do include some defense contractors, including some that, well, include some defense contractors, and but none, they didn't have any ability to shape the findings. So this was an independent study. So the question is, how does industry experience acquisition reform? And I just want to highlight that although I said this is not a study about acquisition reform so much as the acquisition innovations we've been seeing recently, they all just kept calling it acquisition reform. So that's how they're thinking about it. I sent around some initial scoping questions that you can see here, and that was really just to get the folks I talked to focusing on the questions. The topic, this was really couched as exploratory research, so I didn't go into these discussions with a set of survey questions that everybody had to answer. The folks I talked to were typically very senior in their organizations. Some of them had extensive government experience. Others had been program managers in industry for many years. Some had served on the Hill. So it was really quite a broad group with different experiences. I do want to highlight that the discussions were held on a non-attribution basis, and there was a good amount of concern about don't tell the government I said this. They really wanted to highlight that. In some discussions, it came up several times. So there was it seems that there is a gap in getting frank and honest feedback from contractors to the government. And if you think about it, who is going to get that information? Industry is not necessarily going to tell the government directly what they're doing wrong, because nobody wants to be a complainer and not get the next contract. even so in all my work at FFRDCs, you know, if we're viewed as quasi-governmental organizations in that capacity, again, it can be difficult to get frank feedback. And also their work relies on government funding, and government may not be interested in this particular topic versus others. Industry associations are an option, but that's really seen as lobbying. And so that you need to sort of pull it away from that. So this was just an attempt to offer an independent look at it. Again, this, even though it wasn't an acquisition reform study, it became a little bit of one. And the bottom line is that there was some frustration with the ability of the government to make effective acquisition improvements. Stop talking about acquisition reform. We don't need to change things. The acquirers have what they need. They don't know how to use them. The 809 panel came up with great ideas, but they haven't been implemented. And this last comment was particularly interesting. It was from somebody who had worked both on the Hill and in a service on acquisition reform and developing policy. Their take was that when they were, and then went to industry. So their take was when they were working on the Hill and when they were working in the service, they thought that the changes they were making were really transformative and profound. But then when they moved over to industry, it became clear that industry was not tracking these as thoroughly. They viewed it as inside baseball. So that kind of struck me as somebody who has worked on acquisition improvements for 25 years. I was like, uh-oh. So here we have the adaptive acquisition framework. Again, you all know what it is. I will note that Megan McKernan led some work about 7 or 8 years ago that looked at tailoring, and that work found that a lot of these, not this specifically, but there have always been ways of shaping acquisition programs to the needs. So the idea that there is only one way of acquisition before, and then we came up with these great, this framework is not quite accurate. But what this does is essentially offer a set of pre-tailored pathways, which hopefully would make it easier for acquisition professionals to lean out and do different things. Well, here's what the contractor said. They didn't necessarily know what pathway had been used to procure their items. Some of the greater experts at larger firms who had more experience and more contacts in the government actually did feel that the government was leveraging the adaptive acquisition framework reasonably well. Some indicated that they didn't see process changes from before and after. And then a few did have reflections on the middle tier, with the most common feedback being that they really did feel that the middle tier had sped up acquisition in its initial phases, but that they felt that there were new regulations or there was sort of a pullback from MTAs so that they weren't as rapid. There was also a lack of clarity on what would happen at that 5-year mark that our GAO colleagues mentioned. They didn't know what was going to happen next to those programs. Not a surprise, but the industry highlighted that it's great to have all this flexibility, but if it doesn't come with more money, it's hard to know what kind of impact it will have for them. And then this final point about software heavy hardware systems is, I think, worth hammering home. So when we think about the software pathway, that is to buy software. But there are hardware systems that go along the traditional waterfall or major capability pathway that are really, most of their value is in software and they're just in a hardware frame. So the question there is, how can the government get agility from that they need with the software if they're using the hardware, the MCA pathways? So we can come back and talk through that and think that one through, but there may be a sort of a next steps on that one. OTAs were the most frequently mentioned alternative acquisition approach that was discussed in these interviews. When I raised the adaptive acquisition framework, about half the time, the folks I was talking to weren't really that aware of it or were only tangentially aware of it, but everybody knew about OTAs. This chart was done by my colleague Greg Sanders at CSIS, by the way, using FPDS data. So one question that the contractors had was on transition. In one case, I heard a very beautiful story of how OTAs were used effectively, and it did transition to a program of record. But for the most part, there was a sense that these were not transitioning. And furthermore, that they had a lack of transparency on how likely it would be that an OTA could transition. So I heard that they really were thinking, should we bother applying for these? Is this going to take up time of our best engineers who are going to work on that instead of on something that may result in a greater line of business for them? And again, I think they were looking for something that the government really couldn't deliver, which is tell us what you want and we'll get it for you. And that is not the purpose of OTAs. So there was a little gap there. Another question that came up was whether the DoD really understood the industrial base. And I was happy to hear that they felt that for the most part, the seniors on both sides understood each other. Senior leaders in the department were perceived as having a pretty good sense of industry. The challenge is really getting the vision down to lower levels, especially the idea that if you're going to need culture change to involve more risk taking, they didn't really see how that was trickling down. Their sense was that contracting officers are conservative and concerned about how they're being judged, which is on low, they're judged on things that can be measured, which is really cost. And getting contracting officers to take risks or, allowing, I don't want to say fail fast, but, not being criticized for having programs that didn't work out as intended. So that risk taking is a challenge. And then there was a concern that, especially with like small businesses and OTAs, that contracting officers may not understand the business issues like the importance of quarterly earnings. And it's not really the government's job to ensure profits or, good relationships with Wall Street on the part of businesses. But as the government goes out to the non-traditional suppliers, I think sort of thinking through how they're judged by their investors could make the government a more attractive customer. So there is a difference for small businesses, like a huge difference if a contractor is signed on March 31st versus April 1st. It may not make a difference for somebody in the government, but boy, does that make a difference for a small business who's looking for more funding. So that could be
I
something.
think for a big business too, I think they all care.
That's true, but they're a bit like the big five have more stable funding. So for small businesses, it could be live or die, but that's a good point. The issue is a retired former PEO said, look, when I was in the government, I really had to focus on costs. Now that I'm in industry, of course, I have a different perspective. I'm focused on profit. I just want to make a fair profit, but it's really hard when, the government's trying to squeeze every last dime out of you, which is their job. So this is just a point where the interests are different. So this was a little bit depressing for me because I was thinking, all these innovation organizations are terrific and they're all reaching out to different parts of the community, et cetera, et cetera. But then when I heard that we wouldn't need so many innovation organizations if any of them actually worked, that was a little bit depressing, but yeah, that's good feedback. And also concerns about whether these organizations can help programs transition from early stages to programs of record. is a real concern. I mean, is it great? It might be great to have a little project with AFWorks, but if it's not going to be a big program of record, it doesn't give me the long-term stability I need to grow my company. For the last point, this is not new. Innovators may not want to work with the government. The challenge is that the government solutions for this, like pitch days, aren't going to solve the problem because a lot of companies already know that they could work for the government. So going out and telling them, hey, come and do business with us is not going to necessarily solve this. I thought I would flag a few topics that aren't necessarily related to acquisition improvements, but are worthy of note just the same. I hadn't understood before the perception among some in industry that unless you're working the hill, you're not going to get a new program. They try to hire people who have contacts with Congress. You can also hire consulting firms that will help you get in. And that's just a flag for DoD about trying to themselves help businesses get over the valley of death or whatever you want to call it to make sure that those programs persist and not to be directed by the Congress that they should move funds from one priority to another. So I think it's sort of a big picture ecosystem challenge. A second topic was on multi-years, that if multi-years are entirely focused on proving cost savings, then they're missing a key benefit from them. And this for munitions, this is pretty well understood right now. But going forward in the next 10, 20 years, if multi-years are only used to save costs, it really gets away from the supply chain benefits that are really profound. If defense contractors can give their suppliers, multi-year contracts themselves and promise long-term business, they're more likely to be a priority customer for them because most companies in the supply chain may have commercial business as well. So the point is how to get them to prioritize the government business. One industry expert offered this, and really it was stop changing the rules. You can try to rework the adaptive acquisition framework or engage in other types of changing acquisition, but you really do have all the flexibility you need, so use it. This study was an exploratory analysis. I did not have a huge sample. This was really designed to generate research topics for further study. And the first one is, are there pathway options to increase agility for software heavy systems? What is the solution to that? Could it be a seventh pathway? Could programs be assessed on the value of software versus hardware? And, if it's 75% software, go through the software pathway. So this is worth the study. A second question is whether additional transparency on OTA outcomes would add value in some way and give contractors a sense of confidence that if they invested their best engineers in these, it might lead to new contracts. A third topic is whether specific business-oriented training could be worthwhile for contracting officers. And the final question is always how to change and evolve acquisition policy to get best value defense and the taxpayer. So for those of you with industry contacts, I am hoping to do a few more of these structured discussions. So if you want to connect with me here on LinkedIn and reach out, I'd be happy to talk.
Thank you, Cynthia. And I should have said earlier, Stephanie has a special role here. She is the discussant. I wasn't told what that meant, but my interpretation is going to be that I watched the clock while you were thinking. So what impressions, what thoughts do you have after listening to the panelists?
Yeah, no, I appreciate the opportunity to pontificate as a discussant. So thanks everybody for the thoughtful research and sharing the valuable insights. I just had a couple of comments and questions to tee up for consideration. And then, we want to make sure we invite all of you into the discussion. So first, these papers made me think that as an acquisition research community, these give us a lot to think about. I think that, understanding that being able to make data informed decisions doesn't happen by accident. I mean, it rests on a foundation of some of the advancements folks have talked about here: data governance, metrics, valuation frameworks, valuation approaches. This foundation takes real effort. And it occurred to me, just thinking about this as a relatively early period in the adaptive acquisition framework, just reflect on what we're doing as an analytic community to set these pathways on a solid foundation to drive future decision making. I think Dr. Plant, definitely drove home this idea of data informed analytics, and I think we have a real role to play here. And I appreciate the work of my colleagues to highlight that. One of the really key building blocks of this foundation, and again, Dr. LaPlante really foot-stomped this, is the people, the acquisition workforce. Acquisition professionals will be leveraging this data to make hard decisions about what pathway is appropriate for mission needs, how to implement it, what's affordable, where to take risks. I mean, these are hard questions, and I'm glad to have the benefit of Jim on the panel to provide, and hopefully provide a perspective on what the AAF might mean for the acquisition workforce and what DAU is doing to help develop future leaders in this area. But Cynthia's paper, of course, reminds us, however, that the challenge of acquisition, defense acquisition, is in acquisition reform is not just an analytic one. She points to perennial challenges related to aligning government and industry incentives towards advancing strategic goals, forging more high-performing partnerships with industry, setting conditions for innovation and productive risk-taking. I mean, these are not new challenges, and I'm quite certain we won't solve those issues here, but I would be interested in panelists' thoughts on, are there features of the AAF that are unique or not, that might, allow this set of reforms to move the needle in some ways that past efforts might have fallen short. And then finally, I just wanted to provide a few thoughts on this, what I think can be seen between the need for speed and agility on one hand, and the need for evaluation or oversight on the other hand, and what the risk that oversight function might look like, what Jim referred to as bureaucratic goo. And I think the panelists have well argued that oversight has an important role to play. Being able to monitor program performance is important for making programmatic decisions, for communicating to external stakeholders, for forging trust, transparency. I mean, these are all important objectives. But I also would want to note that just going back to fundamentals, the defense acquisition system is about fielding capabilities that the warfighter and the nation really needs. So I think we also need to have a way to evaluate these programs, because these programs are really important, and we need an ability to anticipate, mitigate risks, to identify those innovations that might be promising enough to think about transition or producing at scale, or identifying ones that maybe some of these risks are not paying off and we need to think about doing something differently. I mean, we need an ability to do that, because these capabilities are really important for the future fight. And, the challenge is the threat environment is challenging and it's dynamic, and we need to be able to make good decisions about this. So I guess my hope is that we can think about analysis like this and the work that we all do as acquisition researchers and analysts, less about bureaucratic goo and more about a partnership where we're all working together towards, making sure that we can, meet that operational imperative of a faster and more responsive acquisition system, and delivering capabilities that the nation desperately needs. I think I'll pass it back to you,
Thank
Jim,
you,
to
Stephanie.
either address any of those questions
So
or to offer.
I'm anxious, as you might guess, to talk about the workforce one, but I want to first give the audience a chance. Does anybody in the audience have questions they'd like to ask of any of the panelists? We have one. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you. So I think this is directed to Cynthia, but maybe other panelists have insight. In 2020, we conducted a thorough analysis of OTAs. And what we found is that larger contractors that leverage OTAs, they do so independently through that non-traditional partnership, but that in some cases, as much as 2/3 of all OTA spending with DoD is funneled through these consortium management firms, which introduce tremendous bureaucracy into a process that's supposed to be more free and open. And I was curious if discussion of CMFs came up in your interviews. I certainly view it as a critical, something that needs to change critically in order to make OTAs function as they are intended to. But, you know, my research is dated. So if that came up, I'd be curious to hear what their thoughts were.
I didn't hear so much about consortiums, and that could have just been a random artifact based on the sample. And you know, we know that these have, you know, the increase of them, they have been used. So I'm assuming that there are benefits to the broader industrial base. One small company actually said, you know, I know people complain about OTAs. I would love to have an OTA so I could complain about it. So there is that as well. And just a reflection based on what Stephanie said, and listening to myself and my fellow panelists. With all this discussion of challenges with defense acquisition, we do have to remind ourselves that the United States does have the strongest and most powerful and most capable military in the world. So we must be doing something right. Thank you, Jim, for that.
Good question. Next. Could you identify yourself, please, and where you're from?
Yes, I'm David Jenkins. I'm from Naval Information Warfare Center Pacific down in San Diego. We're a subordinate entity to NAVWAR. Three things. My first 19 years of my career, I was a contracting officer, unlimited warrant. A lot of the things that specifically you said ring very, very true to me. One thing that I would foot stomp is with regard to contracting officers do not understand the contractor quarterly report, quarterly earnings. One class that I found extremely beneficial is North Carolina offers Understanding the Government Contractor Relationship. It's an outstanding class. I would recommend that it would be mandatory for all contracting officers to take that, because it's illuminating when suddenly you realize what motivates contractors to do business with the government, as well as, you know, what motivates them. Number two, contracting officers are absolutely motivated to not take risk. It's, in my opinion, the biggest problem with regard to our procurement system. It's very, very broken. Contracting officers supposedly are supposed to come up with creative ways to deliver to their customer contracting solutions. You need this? Okay, let me, as the trained professional, figure out how to deliver that to you. Contracting officers are not able to do that in reality. Their hands are completely tied. They only have a finite amount of tools that are available to them. By the way, the FAR might allow them many, many tools, but their command, either through acquisition reform policies or something, it suddenly ties their hands, said, nope, we're not going to be using what the regulations allow. We're only going to be focusing on these new policies. This is the new way that we're going to do it. So I would love to see something that maybe Naval Postgraduate School could come out with ways, how do we empower contracting officers to actually reward them for taking risk and actually deliver capabilities to the warfighter. I also asked my contracting officer, unlimited warrant at Naval Information Warfare Center, about the adaptive acquisition framework. He'd never heard of it. So this is the first time I'm hearing about it as well. I was actually really excited when I saw this. Oh, this is great. Suddenly, because we do software development, oh, there's a different pathway. This is wonderful. They're recognizing that, you know, we should be focusing on doing things a lot different than when you're, you know, procuring or buying a ship. And our command, I've never even heard of it. So unfortunately, there's some feedback for you that we're not using it. So.
All right, thank you. I guess there wasn't a question there, but the good insights, and thank you for those. I did want to, it's come up a couple of times, so I wanted to talk about the workforce and what we're doing to get the word out for people. First, whenever I do this, I want to be clear. You can see in the slides, you can see in the discussion, you can see in those comments, there is more to do. So whenever I talk about the things we're doing, I'm not brushing my hands saying all taken care of and all done. But the Adaptive Action Framework and the MTA do give me a chance to point out that we are doing things in new ways and ways that are more responsive. So you've probably thought about DAU as a place where people go to get their certification training, and then they never go back after they've got their level 3 certification. We're trying very hard to reach out to the workforce in a lot of different ways. So in the case of the Adaptive Acquisition Framework, yes, it is in certification courses, at least 3 of them that I could count, probably more than that. So when you get introduced to our world, you're going to get that in your certification training. But probably more important are the things that are not in certification training, because that's just for people who are just starting out, which most people are not. So we have an optional course and a self-directed learning thing you can do online that'll familiarize you with the AAF and all the provisions that go with it. We also have a workshop on middle tier acquisition itself. If you go to the DAU website and sign up for search on MTA, you'll get that workshop. We host the reference materials that people are often referring to here. The AAF website is hosted at DAU. It's aaf.dau.edu. I checked it this morning. If you use Google and look for Adaptive Action Framework, it will take you to that website. And there's a lot of information there that people can get if they're interested and want to learn more. We've got a lot of videos, videos of events like this, videos of people talking about what they were thinking when the AAF was built in the beginning. And maybe my favorite is we have a new workshop called Kobayashi Maru. I'm looking for those Trekkies who recognize the reference. And it is an event that gets a team together, and they have it's a 2.5-day event. It's pretty intense, and they have problems to solve. Spoiler alert, the MTA helps you solve those problems. It gives people an experience and not just lecture about what they're doing. The point is, we're using the whole spectrum of tools to try to reach out to people and help them understand this world better. So again, more to do, but we are doing those things. Any other questions from the audience? Yes.
Hi, Jonathan Wong from Rand Corporation. Hello, my colleagues. And
a lot of Rand Corporation people here.
I know. Poor Cynthia's in a Rand sandwich right there. My question is actually aimed more at our colleagues at GAO. I'm curious if you have in your work and in your research examining MTAs, have you seen how those MTAs fit in context? Because from what I understand, the MTAs are supposed to help kind of bring in commercial technology, maybe inform some requirements, maybe be a capability in and of itself. So I'm kind of curious if you've seen how the services have been and components have been using MTAs within the context of the other frameworks as well. Thank you.
No, thank you for that question. I think what we found that was, somewhat discouraging is the desire to use the MTA pathway as a way to start programs that would otherwise be MCAs or MDAPs, but shave a couple of years of paperwork off and not focus necessarily on delivering capability, but take that short-term gain with starting quicker and figuring you got 5 years as a rapid prototyping program, then another 5 as a rapid fielding. And then whatever you have at the end of that 10 years is better than what you started with. And then you can take that into the major capability acquisition pathway at whatever milestone makes sense. So, I think that, Jim, at DAU, I think you face a battle of swimming upstream in some ways, in the sense that the program structures need to change to get better outcomes from the pathways. You can't put the same type of programs into a different pathway and expect different results. You have to take iterative approaches that are structured around minimum viable products, engage with the user throughout the development process to where you don't start off with a high performance requirement, define technical specs needed to meet those requirements, go through a design process and hope after 5 years or 10 years, you've delivered something that somewhat meets that performance requirement. You start with a big picture. What are our most important needs? And you work with your user through a design process where the design process concludes with the requirement, the performance requirement. And that performance requirement coincides with the minimum viable product. And once you have that solidified, you move out and produce it quickly. And there's not just one train leaving the station every 10, 15 years. You're constantly circling back to get new technology and continue to iterate on that minimum viable product that you've delivered sooner to your warfighter. So it's a constant iterative cycle. It's a different mindset for acquisition than the traditional linear development approaches.
Thank you. And that gets us to the end of our time. So I want to thank you all for being here. And I want to finish with a positive note. The nature of this has been some things that are challenges, and that's important. We need to understand that. But there's a lot of energy around this subject. A lot of people are interested in it. that website I referred to earlier got 210,000 sessions this fiscal year so far. So a lot of people are interested. They're getting information. It was born in a different administration and has carried over to this one and has been done in support of Congress. So the organizations understand we've got to do these things and make this kind of progress. I think that's optimistic. And most importantly, there are a lot of people who attribute faster delivery, faster programs, and more efficiency to being able to use these pathways. We will continue to make them better, but there is real progress here. And I think that's something we shouldn't lose sight of. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, panelists, for your research, and have a good day.